Hello, and welcome to the Office of Child Care Monitoring National Overview for State Administrators. The purpose of this training is to share with you a complete high-level picture of OCC monitoring, what it looks like and who will be involved and when, as we prepare to begin formal monitoring of your state's CCDF program. The objectives of today's session are as follows. First, to learn about OCC's monitoring approach, the topics included in Cycle 1, and who will be engaged in the monitoring process. Second, to identify the 3 phases of monitoring and key activities occurring within each phase. And finally, to understand what happens next related to the OCC monitoring process. Here is the flow of today's training. We will begin by providing background on the OCC monitoring system. Then, we will provide a high-level overview of the 3 phases of OCC monitoring. And we'll conclude by providing what to expect next as states step into the monitoring process. As a state that will be monitored within the upcoming fiscal year, the goal of today's session is to get you oriented to OCC's monitoring system. This session will give you a sense of the big picture. You will be invited to participate in a smaller group training closer to the start of your monitoring work. That training will provide a deeper dive into completing the initial tasks in OCC's monitoring process. We will talk more about these trainings later in today's session.
We begin by providing some background on the OCC monitoring process. Prior to developing the system, we wanted to learn as much as possible, since conducting on-site compliance reviews was new to the Office of Child Care. We had conversations with CCDF administrators, national experts engaged in other monitoring systems, and federal partners with experience in monitoring other federally funded programs. Then, we conducted early pilots in states. The feedback and lessons learned contributed to the design of the final system, which you will hear about today. The OCC monitoring system is guided by 3 key principles to ensure effectiveness. The first key principle focuses on transparency, specifically on engaging states throughout the process and ensuring clear communication of expectations. The second principle is to make monitoring useful to the states, determining compliance as well as supporting states in administering their program to comply with the CCDF regulations. Rather than being a punitive system, the monitoring system is designed to help states identify technical assistance needs and areas for continuous quality improvement. The third principle prioritizes efficiency. Throughout the process, OCC will think strategically about how to use existing grantee data, will identify gaps in data or other necessary documentation, and will synthesize data and documentation prior to the site visit to minimize duplicative requests. The monitoring system was developed to determine state compliance with the Child Care and Development Block Grant (CCDBG) Act of 2014 and the Child Care and Development Fund (CCDF) Final Rule and the state's approved plan. The goals of the monitoring system are to ensure compliance with CCDF regulations and approved CCDF plan, to identify technical assistance needs to meet CCDF requirements, and to identify promising practices to inform continuous quality improvement. It is important to note that the OCC monitoring process is not a gotcha. The goal is to provide the state with every opportunity to demonstrate compliance. The state has opportunities to provide evidence throughout the process. The approach that resulted is shown on the graphic on the screen. Let's break it down by component. The formal monitoring approach began with the approval of the 2019-2021 triennial CCDF state plans. States are currently implementing their approved 3-year CCDF plans. States are divided into 3 monitoring cohorts of 17 states each. One cohort is visited every year. We will share that cohort list momentarily. Monitoring includes an in-depth review of each state's policies, procedures, rules, regulations, etc., as well as their practices on the ground, against CCDF regulations and against what is written in the state's approved CCDF plan. The areas of focus for monitoring are called monitoring topics and will be discussed momentarily. OCC provides ongoing oversight and support of states throughout the plan period. Here is the list of cohorts for the first 3-year cycle. The 3-cohort monitoring cycle aligns with the CCDF plan period. Cycle 1 covers fiscal year 2019 through fiscal year 2021. The state cohort assignments mirror the improper payment error rate reviews, but are shifted by 1 year so that no state is required to undergo an error rate review and monitoring in the same federal fiscal year. Today's training is provided for all states in Cohort 3. We are initially rolling out the monitoring system with states and the District of Columbia. During the first 3-year cycle, we will monitor states for compliance with the specific topic areas shown here on the screen. Within each topic, there are specific CCDF regulations for which the states will be required to demonstrate compliance. Those regulations are also mapped to specific questions in the state plan. In the handouts for today's webinar, available in the file download pod within the Adobe Room, you will find a handout that lists the monitoring topic areas. If there are concerns with a state's compliance with other regulations, those will be handled separately through the traditional oversight process. Note that for Program Integrity and Accountability, Topic 11, our goal is not to gather data on improper payments. That is a separate information collection and requirement for states. The monitoring teams will be looking to ensure that states have in place processes and practices to effectively administer the program. Each state's monitoring effort will be guided by an OCC monitoring team that includes representatives of OCC and OCC's monitoring contractor, WRMA. OCC staff lead the monitoring process. All members of the OCC monitoring team, both OCC staff and WRMA staff, work together to gather and analyze evidence of the state's compliance with the CCDF regulations being monitored and to recommend preliminary compliance determinations. States have the flexibility to identify their own team to support the monitoring effort. We strongly recommend that state administrators involve other state-level CCDF leadership, e.g., subsidy, licensing, monitoring, and professional development managers, in all phases of the monitoring process, including training and planning calls with the OCC monitoring team. It may be worthwhile to bring other partners, contractors, other state agencies, etc., into the planning process early as well. This will ensure that the state administrator has support throughout the process and that state staff and partners understand the monitoring goals, activities, timelines, and expectations.
We now turn to provide a high-level overview of the 3 phases of the OCC monitoring process. We will go into a little more detail about these shortly, and into much more detail on future trainings. But here is a high-level overview of the major activities in each of the 3 phases of OCC monitoring. During the pre-visit phase, the OCC monitoring team and the state will work collaboratively to identify state-specific approaches that ensure that the monitoring effort captures data about the state's compliance with the CCDF regulations within the context of the state's CCDF plan and child care system structure. Data collection and analysis begins in this phase with the monitoring team reviewing written materials provided by the state. The Onsite phase allows the OCC monitoring team to collect data in person through interviews with and demonstrations by the state and its partners, as well as guided case file reviews. Those guided reviews look at both subsidy or family case files and provider licensing or monitoring case files. During the post-visit phase, the OCC monitoring team continues to review and analyze the data collected, works with the state to collect any additional data needed to complete the analysis, and makes preliminary determinations of the state's compliance with each regulation monitored. The arrow on the bottom of the slide is a reminder that data and evidence collection and analysis is happening during all three phases of monitoring. OCC will work collaboratively during all three phases to gather and review evidence. Today's training will describe the typical monitoring process. However, we acknowledge that these are not typical times. At the time of this presentation, the country is still in the midst of the COVID-19 crisis, and we cannot predict what the situation will look like as the monitoring visit dates get closer. We want to stress that we know just how valuable the on-site visits are to the integrity of monitoring. We hear that again and again from the monitoring teams. However, in the event that visiting your state is not possible due to this or another emergency, the monitoring team will reach out to plan a virtual visit as an alternative to the on-site visit. While we know that we cannot fully replicate the on-site process, we will have some of the same kinds of data collection sessions with the state and its partners that we would have had on site.
Now let's look at each phase of the monitoring process in a little more detail, starting with the pre-visit phase. The pre-visit phase begins 4 to 6 months prior to the actual on-site visit. To kick off the pre-visit work, OCC will host national training calls with smaller subsets of the cohort, called sub-cohorts, which are grouped based on the date of the state's on-site visits. That said, some Cohort 2 states will be beginning this process very soon. OCC has drafted the national schedule of on-site visits for all the states. The schedule considered numerous variables, including major holidays and events, federal conferences, state timelines, and so on. If you have not already heard from your region, they will be contacting you soon, indicating the dates of your on-site visit. If you have questions, please follow up with your region. Once on-site visit dates are confirmed, states will receive a letter listing those dates, along with a customized estimated timeline of state monitoring activities called the State Monitoring Activities Document. Here's a sample of that document, again called the State Monitoring Activities Document, that states will receive with their confirmation letter. This document provides more detail about the state-specific monitoring activities. When you receive your state-specific document, you will see the estimated dates, noted as week of, for each activity in the left column and estimated deadlines in the yellow rows. The timeline for the pre-visit activities is based on the date of the on-site visit and on the ideal timeframes needed for the state and the OCC monitoring team to complete their monitoring tasks. Along with the letter and state monitoring activities document, states also receive an email with links to online doodle polls in order to provide input on the dates for the state-specific planning and follow-up calls. To be clear, state-specific just means the trainings or calls, etc., that are focused around a state's monitoring. These are not national in scope. Those doodle polls allow the OCC monitoring team to arrange state-specific planning. You will see those state-specific planning calls on your screen noted here in dark blue boxes. Monitoring activities within the pre-visit phase center around these state planning calls. State planning calls typically last 1 to 2 hours and occur at planned intervals throughout the process. Again, we strongly encourage state administrators to engage other state staff and partners in all phases of the monitoring process, starting with the state pre-visit planning calls. Here, we add in activities that the state will complete between the state planning calls. First, before the first call, the state will complete the compliance demonstration chart. This is a document that allows the state to propose its approach for demonstrating compliance with the 11 monitoring topics and will guide the process for data collection. The sub-cohort training will go into detail on how to complete this chart. On state planning call number 1, the monitoring team and the state will discuss the approaches and make any changes or adjustments to the demonstration chart as needed. Then, the state will complete the document submission chart and send it to the monitoring team along with all the written materials. This will start the desk review process and support the development of the on-site visit schedule. State planning call number 2 will focus on reviewing the draft on-site schedule and the criteria for selecting case files for the guided case file review. After state planning call number 2, the state will review the revised on-site schedule and confirm participants' times and locations and so on. The state will also begin to identify specific case files to pull for the monitoring team based on the criteria discussed on the call. On state planning call number 3, roughly 1 week before the on-site visit, the monitoring team and the state confirm the on-site visit schedule and finalize the other logistical details of the visit. As mentioned, we will get into the details of the process and the documents required of the state on the sub-cohort training. We urge you not to begin work on the 2 documents until after you complete that training. If you are curious, the documents are included as part of the compliance demonstration packet, which you can download from today's handouts before exiting the training, or wait to receive them with the sub-cohort training invitation. One of the things we want to acknowledge is that the heaviest workload for states within the OCC monitoring process is the work in the pre-visit phase. States have acknowledged that this is different from many of the monitoring or auditing processes that they have experienced, which tend to have minimal pre-work, but significant work while the team is on site. Within the OCC monitoring process, the heaviest lift is the document submission process, which comes in the pre-visit phase at the beginning of the process. Submitting the requested documents and doing so within the time frames takes some time. However, spending effort on the process and submitting everything within the time frames provided allows the process to go smoothly and is designed to lighten the lift of the on-site visit.
After all of that preparation, it is finally time for the monitoring team to come on site. Here is a quick overview of how that on-site time is typically spent. It is important to understand what the on-site visit is and what it is not. The on-site visit is a continuation of the data collection begun in the pre-visit phase. The monitoring team will be gathering additional information regarding the state's compliance by asking questions and seeing state and local practices in action. The on-site visit is not a high-stress time for the state to conduct elaborate presentations or create exhibits showcasing state activities. Further, it is not a time in which the state will receive the compliance decisions. The monitoring team still needs to analyze the data received after the visit in order to make compliance decisions. The on-site visit starts with an entrance conference that includes brief presentations by OCC and the state. The state may present an overview of state systems and processes, as well as highlight successes and challenges in their CCDF program. State administrators often choose to invite other state officials and/or partners to participate in the entrance conference. The majority of the visit will be spent in data collection sessions, which may include staff and partner interviews, demonstrations of program operations, resources, and systems, such as the state's electronic subsidy management system or online licensing tool, and guided reviews of family and provider case files. The goals of the data collection sessions are to provide the monitoring team with a comprehensive understanding of how the state is implementing the CCDF regulations being monitored, to validate evidence observed during the desk review by observing state practices in action on the ground, and to fill in gaps of knowledge that the monitoring team was not able to gain during the desk review. At this time, because the focus of the monitoring process is on the state's practices and its oversight of its contracted and local partners, OCC has chosen not to include childcare provider visits as part of its standard data collection processes. A short debriefing will occur at the end of each day to follow up on questions by the monitoring team or the state, as well as to prepare for the next day's activities. On day 3, there will be a final debriefing to gather feedback from the state team on the monitoring process and to review the post-visit processes. Here is a high-level view of the typical 3-day on-site visit schedule, which incorporates the activities discussed in the previous slide. On day 1, we spend time getting a high-level overview of how the state's program is administered. We spend most of the day on data collection sessions, typically at the state offices. On day 2, the monitoring team will usually divide into 2 teams to see subsidy, licensing and monitoring, and other partner sites, often outside of the capital area. For example, Team A may travel an hour away to visit a local licensing office in the morning and travel again later in the day to visit a subsidy office. Meanwhile, Team B may stick closer to the capital area, visiting a subsidy office in the morning and then spending the afternoon at a nearby licensing agency. Typically during these off-site visits, the local subsidy and licensing and monitoring staff walk the monitoring team through the selected case files. Locations for the off-site data collection sessions are selected in consultation with the state to ensure that the state has information in advance of the visit about the topics to be discussed and the activities to be conducted at each location. While local and partner staff are the interviewees at these sites, state-level staff are always welcome to attend these off-site sessions. On the 3rd day, the monitoring team will come back together, typically at the state office, for additional data collection and for the final on-site debriefing. Again, no compliance decisions are shared during the on-site visit.
Once the on-site visit is over, the post-visit phase begins. After the on-site visit, the monitoring team may reach out to you as needed via email, phone, or online meeting. The goal of this post-visit communication is to ask final questions of the state about the data collected in the pre-visit and on-site visit phases, and to collect additional data as needed to help complete the monitoring team's documentation and data analysis. Once the monitoring team completes the documentation of the evidence, the team will make recommended preliminary compliance determinations. The documentation and recommended determinations go to the OCC's compliance verification team, which will review the evidence collected and confirm the preliminary determinations of the state's compliance or non-compliance with each regulation being monitored. This review helps to ensure consistency and fairness in the compliance determinations. Because OCC wants this process to be as open and transparent as possible, we'll hold a virtual exit conference with you prior to the formal issuance of written findings, so that you have an opportunity to hear the compliance verification team's determinations, ask questions, provide additional clarifications if needed, and discuss the next steps in the process. You can determine the state participants to include on that virtual meeting. After the virtual exit conference, the state receives the preliminary monitoring report. If there are any compliance concerns, the state will have an opportunity to respond prior to the final determination letter being issued. After the virtual exit conference, OCC reviews and considers the state's written response, should the state opt to provide one regarding noncompliances. Then OCC issues the final compliance determination.
Now that you have a sense of the major activities involved in OCC's monitoring process, we will talk about what comes next. To kick off the real pre-visit work, OCC will host national training calls with smaller subsets of the cohort. Again, we're calling these smaller groups sub-cohorts. Sub-cohorts are grouped based on the date of the state's on-site visits. This will allow states to get more detailed, just-in-time training for their monitoring responsibilities closer to the start of their pre-visit work. The sub-cohort trainings will go into more detail about the pre-visit activities and the tasks that we've discussed broadly today. You will get detailed information and guidance on how to complete the charts, how to submit information, and the kinds of evidence that OCC would look for within each topic area and regulation. States will receive a link to register for the appropriate sub-cohort training from their regional office as you step into the pre-visit phase. An additional resource for you and your state partners is the OCC Monitoring Process Guide for states. This guide provides details about each of the steps of the monitoring process and can be downloaded via the OCC website. The Process Guide for states is a go-to resource as you move through the monitoring process. In the guide, you'll find an overview of the monitoring process along with detail about each phase. Lessons learned from those who have already gone through monitoring. Tips to share with members of your state team. And links to resources and training to learn more. Thank you for taking time to complete this training. Please direct any follow-up questions to your regional office.